Doctor, what are your thoughts, having the experience that you do, thoughts about traditional cancer treatments like chemo and radiation?
My goal, always having been trained as a conventional researcher, is that we all have to work together. It sounds like a cliche, but I really mean that. You know, as my lecture
Hmm.
today, I was talking about the fact that some of the greatest conventional doctors are a place like the Mayo Clinic, and if I have a diagnostic dilemma or I have a patient I can't figure out what the problem is, I'll send them to the Mayo Clinic. And that's the way it should be, and we should work together. And Mayo Clinic doctors are very willing to do that, even if you're alternative. Other institutions are not so willing. But a lot of conventional oncology isn't that effective. I mean, there was a study just came out a month ago in Nature magazine, which is one of the preeminent science journals, which said finally that most chemotherapy for most cancers doesn't work, and they explained the biochemical reasons why it doesn't. There are a few cancers that do respond really well to chemo, but they're rare cancers. They're not that common.
Mm.
There are over 100 different types of cancer, depending on what book you read. The ones that respond are testicular cancer, which Lance Armstrong was diagnosed with, acute lymphocytic leukemia childhood, choriocarcinoma, which is a rare cancer of pregnancy, some lymphomas. But other than those few cancers, most cancers do not respond to chemotherapy, even though they've been looking into it now since 1946 was the first effort to look into synthetic drugs to treat cancer.
Hmm.
It just doesn't work that well, despite the billions of academic research funding that has been allocated to it. There are a few cancers where it works. Hodgkin's disease. 80% of early stage Hodgkin's can be cured with conventional chemo, and I'm the first person to say that's wonderful. Dr. DeVita, who used to be head of the NCI, first discovered the MOP chemo regimen, which is very effective for the